All right, we're back. And so we had just completed our test of cognitive complexity. We just did the most popular measure. I will tell you that when I do this class in person, there are people who will range from literally one thing per person in their columns. Like that's all they wrote was one thing about each person. To I've seen people write like 23 things in I give my students maybe 2 or 3 minutes to write something. And so, for somebody to get 23, 25 things written down, that's pretty darn quick. People vary on this trait a lot. And it's not better or worse that somebody wrote down 2 things versus somebody wrote down 25 things. This is just a personality trait. So let's talk a little bit about cognitive complexity. So people who display higher scores on that particular assessment tend to score higher on tests of empathy, that they tend to be better at perspective taking. They tend to have better persuasive skills, and they are better at coping with ambiguity and the unexpected. Whereas people who are lower in cognitive complexity tend to be people who display conservative political stances, especially if they are elected politicians. In fact, that's who the subject sample was when they tested this hypothesis. So having conservative political stances, we only know for sure that that's true among politicians because it hasn't really been tested on other people. So that doesn't mean that a person who's lower in cognitive complexity has no empathy. It just means that they are lower in empathy, right? That they aren't as good at taking perspectives as a person who's higher in that, and so on. So it's really important that you think about things as shades of gray rather than black and white. Like you're not empathetic or not. You're like some degree of empathy, and people who are higher in cognitive complexity are more towards the higher empathy end of that spectrum. Because a lot of times when people see this, they go, well, wait a second, you just told me it's just a personality trait, and then you show me all these good things that are associated with that personality trait. That's true. Having more cognitive complexity is associated with these better outcomes, but it's not a given that if you scored lower. I'm not sure where my student who wrote one thing per person would have fallen on an empathy scale, or how well that person would have coped with ambiguity and stuff. So I don't know. I can't say whether that person has empathy or not, but I can just say that think of all of these things as just continuums, and that the higher your cognitive complexity, the closer you are to the extreme end of higher empathy, higher perspective taking, and stuff like that. What I really wanted to dive into, though, is something that I'll bet that you've thought about without knowing the names for it. This is called SelfComplexity. This is the idea of how much you see yourself as having multifacets. Like, how complex are you? And I don't mean like, oh, I'm hard to understand. I mean complex like, holding lots of different roles, having lots of different skills and abilities, being flexible in a new situation so that you can, kind of adapt your behavior to the situation. That's higher self-complexity. So people who are higher in that, they tend to differentiate themselves into constructs that are independent of each other. So that's what that means is, let's say I was lower on self-complexity and I was trying to describe myself. I might say that I am friendly and I'm outgoing. Those aren't really independent constructs, are they? Because friendly people, outgoing people, there's some overlap in those two traits, right? There's some overlap in those constructs. By the way, construct is a word that means, I just remembered it as meaning sort of thing, because that's how sophisticated I am. But I was, it's hard to define what a construct is. It's like an idea, or I'll define it with another complex word, which is concept. Sorry, that's my Audubon clock. That's the goose hour is chiming. So I will define construct with the word concept, and I don't know if that helps a lot, but constructs are sort of theoretical. They're not real. Like, what is friendliness? It's not I guess you know it when you see it. It's kind of like that, isn't it? It's not a concrete thing. And so constructs are sort of theoretical, non-concrete things. So if I'm lower in self-complexity, I might say I'm friendly and outgoing. If I'm higher in self-complexity, I might say I'm friendly, I'm efficient, I am thoughtful, things that are what we call orthogonal. They're separate from each other. So higher complexity, you're going to offer a wider variety of types of constructs to describe yourself. People who are higher in self-complexity do a better job of separating their negative affect, which in this context, the word affect means emotion or feelings. So they do a better job of separating negative affect from separate areas of the self. So for example, if a person who's higher in self-complexity gets fired, for example, so they're very upset. I just lost my job. I have no other prospects looming. I don't know if I'll be able to live on unemployment. What is happening? I'm so upset, right? Obviously that would be a very upsetting event, but they can, people who are higher in self-complexity can kind of compartmentalize that upsetness into the realm of work and say, my work self took a bit of a hit today, but hey, I still have my friend self. I still have my family self. I still have my, dog, daddy or mommy self. I've got all these other aspects of myself that are doing fine. Now, those other things might be being threatened, right? Like my family self and my dog might be threatened by the fact that I don't have an income right now. But I don't take all that negative affect and bad feelings about having gotten fired and put it into my other parts of my life and say it's my whole self that's messed up. It's my whole self doesn't deserve anything good. It's just one area of myself. So higher complexity is kind of protective like that. It helps the person to avoid sort of generalized depression because they can say, well, just, I got a hit at work, but everything else is going well or whatever. People who are higher in self-complexity are better able to see differences between themselves and others. They're less likely to suppose that if they are feeling something, probably other people are feeling those same things. Projection is, a Freudian term. We've already studied Freud, so you guys should know projection as a defense mechanism. But we do it all the time. I don't mean to say Freud's right about something, but we do it a lot. We assume that what we know, other people know. We assume that, what bothers us will bother other people. When we were talking about behaviorism, I mentioned, the law of effect, and you need to find reinforcements that the learner wants, punishments that they don't want. You can't just give them outcomes that you would want or you wouldn't want, right? I'm going to pass out black licorice as rewards if you guys don't pretend like you remember me saying this, right? So just because I would want to receive black licorice, I shouldn't project onto you that you want black licorice. Just because something is scary to me, I shouldn't project that onto you and assume you're scared of it too, right? That's a person who's higher in self-complexity recognizes the difference between what is true for them and is not necessarily true for everybody else, right? So these are sort of the things that go along with self-complexity. All right, I told you this chapter is a little disjointed because this is how cognition is. We can explain certain aspects of certain things, and we're not like Freud with a giant overarching theory or the behaviorist with a giant overarching theory. So Kelly developed what was called the personal construct theory. And basically he viewed people as naive scientists, that we go through life actively trying to discover the world around us. So this kind of sounds like what the Gestalt psychologists were saying at the beginning of this chapter, right? That we're all trying to collect information from the environment and make sense of it, right? Kelly really takes this a little bit farther by saying it's not just us collecting information through our sensory organs. We actually go out and try to discover the world around us and try to make sense of the world around us. So we look out the window, we listen to something, we taste something new. We're trying to figure out the world around us. This is a very what is known as constructivist view. This is the view that the person is trying to construct their own reality. They're trying to construct their own understanding of how the world works. So instead of being passive, where the world tells you how it is, We, under Kelly's theory, says, no, we are a bunch of little scientists who are out collecting data and trying to make sense of what's going on. So one thing Kelly says that we tend to do as humans is, in our efforts to understand other people, we will use the kind of bipolar constructs that I was trying to tell you not to do earlier in this lecture. But this is a really strong human tendency. We use what we call bipolar constructs. We say, they're a warm person or they're a cold person. And what I was trying to say earlier, let's be honest, this is a continuum of, you're a really warm, friendly, engaging person, through kind of you're a neutral person down to you're actually a cold and off-putting person. And there's, all along in between. That's how the world really is. That's how people really are. But what we often do as, little naive scientists is we meet people and we place them into these bipolar constructs. You're warm or you're cold. You're flexible or you're dogmatic. You're intelligent or you're unintelligent. You're tall or you're short, right? And there's nothing in between. Right? Everything is sort of these polar opposites. So you can imagine that this tendency that we all carry around with us makes it really easy for us to categorize people who we've just met. We don't really know that much about them, but we can take what little information we have and categorize them. And it's one of the biggest reasons why we are such a polarized world right now, is that we have caricatures of other people on TikTok and Instagram and all these other places where we consume information. And we can very quickly, by looking at somebody's post without enough information some of the times, place them into a category and say we agree with them or disagree with them. They're smart or they're dumb. They're bigoted or they're not. They're racist or anti-racist. We can very quickly put people into categories without really knowing enough to be able to put them into those categories. And those categories are probably incorrect, right? We probably shouldn't be putting people into bipolar constructs, right? We should probably be trying to figure out where they place along the continuum. But it's too much cognitive effort. Honestly, that's why we don't do it. So we might, as we get to know somebody, tack on a little bit more detail, but it's still kind of bipolar, where we say, okay, so we put them into the intelligent category. And then now within intelligence, do I mean they have academic smarts or do I mean that they have street smarts? And it's like those are two polar opposites, or they're two separate categories that are not really the same continuum. And that if you have academics intelligence, that means by definition you can't have street smarts intelligence. Like that's how we tend to categorize people. And you can imagine, if you think of your own examples, you're probably going to recognize this is what we do, right? And we do it automatically. It's not like people are trying to be mean. We're really trying to save our own cognitive energy. So we're just trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to figure it out, and with as little effort as we can. Constructive alternativism, is the way. This is the term that describes the way that we think about the world being subject to personal interpretation, right? There are many valid and useful ways to view the world. Kelly used the term to construe the world. How can I construe the world? It's like short for construct, right? There are lots of different ways to correctly see the world. I have not taught this class since the whole, fake news thing really took off. The last time I taught it was fall of 2018. So I haven't had a chance to get to use some of this, fake news as good examples. But when a person sees the world differently than you, that doesn't mean that they are wrong. It means that they see the world differently than you do. There's lots of ways to see the exact same event. Lots of useful ways to see the exact same event. They are not going to... You can take one completely objective event, a car accident. Okay, the driver of each car probably thinks the other driver's at fault. There's the occasional time where one person gets out and goes, oh my gosh, I was looking down. But most of the time, there's some kind of discrepancy between the two drivers about exactly what happened, exactly who caused it, right? It's a car accident. How can you guys not agree? I'll give you a great example, and some of you may have been in this kind of car accident. When a person is turning left and gets hit by the oncoming traffic, the person turning left oftentimes thinks that the oncoming traffic must have been going too fast. But it turns out that's irrelevant because it's the left-hand turner's responsibility to not turn unless it's completely safe and clear. So the left-hand turner says you came out of nowhere, and the straight driver said you weren't supposed to turn if there were cars coming towards you. Two completely different views of exactly the same event. It's really important to remember, I'm trying to use really super concrete examples. It's really super important to realize that because you're thinking about the world in a particular way and you meet up with somebody who thinks about it in a different way, that does not necessarily make either one of you wrong, and it doesn't make either one of you bad. That's where we are right now in this world. It's misinformation, disinformation, fake news. You're doing it on purpose, trying to mislead. That's really not how most of us go through life. Most of us go through life trying to make sense of the world. The presence of different personal constructs are what really cause the differences in our responses to situations and to other people. Right? We have all developed our own personal constructs through our own experiences in the world, our own interpretations of those experiences in the world. And so none of us is perfectly right in any particular situation. Now, he called this construal, by the way. This idea, the way that we think about the world is subject to personal interpretation. He had the term construal to describe that. So he definitely likes the sounds construe. He likes that a lot. Us interpreting the experience is our own construal of that experience. The organization corollary says that people differ in how personal constructs relate to one another. So all of us have some number of superordinate constructs. These are the constructs that are general, they're widely applicable, they sort of are in play in lots of different circumstances. So for example, you have a construct about how you should act when you're in school. And it was something that probably started to be developed when you were in kindergarten. And it got modified as you went through different grades. By middle school, and you had to start moving classes every time the bell rang. That had an impact on your superordinate construct of what it means to be in school. By the time you got to high school, and there's a little bit more flexibility about things that were going on. Some people didn't have to be at school all day, all these different things going on. That had another impact on your superordinate construct about what it means to be in school. By the time you get to college, you may not even set foot on campus. Your construct of what it meant to go to school in kindergarten and your construct of what it means to go to school in college is vastly different, but it still is generally applicable, right? You still understand what it means to go to class in a classroom. You know what it means to go to class in an online class. You have like all these different components to your superordinate construct, but it's still general and it's widely acceptable, widely applicable to lots of different situations. Your subordinate constructs, on the other hand, are specific examples. So if you only want to talk about exactly what it means to be an online student, you might have certain constructs that only apply to those circumstances when you're taking an online class, and other constructs that only apply when you're taking a face-to-face class. So if you think about subordinate, they're just a little bit more specific, right? A little bit more, they still completely relate to those superordinate constructs. I'm using going to school because, again, I like to try and use super concrete examples. And then you have to think about this in terms of personality, right? And so as far as personality, your superordinate construct might be that in general, you are more, what's a good word for it, where you don't necessarily talk to strangers, you don't talk to just whoever's there. And so that might be your superordinate construct, is that generally, I'm slow to warm up, or, I don't necessarily talk to everybody. Your subordinate construct might be, except for unless I'm with friends and this new person is actually a friend of a friend, and then I might be more chatty, right? So that's like your subordinate component of your personality, where you're like, in general, I'm not very talkative to new people. Subordinate is like, well, in a specific circumstance, I might behave differently than that. And there's a specific contexts that would elicit different behavior from me. We see relatively consistent behavior in people, usually because of their relatively stable construal of the world. That as they enter into new circumstances, they will bring in these superordinate constructs as often as they can, and it'll cause them to basically behave very similarly across different circumstances. And that's why we can see evidence of personality in people. That's where we get that consistency, is really through their consistent interpretation of things. All right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we will pick up with a little more Kelly on the other side.